Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja. And what follows this introduction is a webinar that I had conducted previously, a live webinar, and I thought I should edit it and make it available to a wider audience. So without further ado, here is an edited webinar, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. And today I wanted to spend some time on Roman Jakobson, especially on his first essay where he explains the poetic function, right? Which is, I think, really important. Now, if you've read the introduction, Jakobson was originally from Russia, and he could speak and lecture in 6 languages, all of them in Russian. Right? This first essay, Linguistics and Poetics, is the concluding essay where he discusses the poetic function of the language. And if you recall on page 85 of Eagleton's book, that's where Eagleton discusses these 6 functions within a communicative act that he's trying to describe over here, right? And what he's trying to do is this is kind of a really, really groundbreaking intervention into how linguists thought of themselves, and then how they thought of themselves separate from poetics. And he is trying to bridge that gap, like that linguistics and poetics can work together. Now, until the Department of Linguistics, our English department and Department of Linguistics and Technical Communication at one point used to be one department. And when they were one department, our English department did offer a PhD in poetics. And that degree was highly, of course, influenced by the people in linguistics departments. But now I don't think so we offer a degree or a concentration in poetics. We just don't have the linguistic expertise to do that. But remember in his 6 functions of an act of communication, depending on where the emphasis was, what he's challenging, of course, is one of the assertions in Saussurean linguistics that after a sign is arbitrarily constructed and accepted, it becomes fixed. But what he's saying is that, okay, signifier and signified are only one part of an act of communication. And he's saying that here are certain things. So on page 1070 is where he lays down his structure, right? That any act of communication already presupposes an other towards whom the act of communication is directed. So there is an addresser and there is an addressee who receives the message, right? Mediating between the two are 1, 2, 3, 4 things that he talks about. The content of the message itself, the message, the contact and code, right? So if I am going to say anything to Derek, I am the addresser, he's the addressee, and then my message must have some kind of content that I deliver through language, right? It must also have a message. We must have some way of contacting each other, right? Email, verbal communication, whatever. And then we must have a common code that makes it possible for us to understand each other. Now, the poetic function, according to him, is when the message itself is the focus of this act of communication, right? That's when language becomes poetic. That's when a poem becomes a poem. When I am not passing a message to you, I'm writing a poem, it uses certain techniques and all, but it draws attention to its own self, its own poeticity. And that is what he's calling the poetic function of language. And what he's saying is that it shouldn't be separate from linguistic, because within the poetic function, there are rhythms that a poem must follow. There are things stressed, unstressed. There are, all the things that you have learned, alliteration and everything else that language uses to create the poetic layer of language, right? And that's why he's saying is that we can study poetry as a pursuit of linguistics if we focus on the poetic function of language itself. That's my understanding of it. Already presupposing that the addresser and the addressee have a shared code, because that's a prerequisite for an act of communication. But if you want to go to it structurally, what he's also saying is that the absences are also part of the communicational act. So things that are metalingual, right, which are paralingual, which don't necessarily need to be part of the language, and that would be the rhythm, that would be the meter, right? That would be whatever resonance is in the poem, that will carry through the poetic function of language. The meaning may not, right? So for example, music, Levi, right? You and me can listen to a German operatic performance, right? Or an opera. We may not understand what they're singing, but there is something more than just the code in that language, and that code is metalingual. It is the rhythm of the music, right? Or the resonance of the music, the point or counterpoint. Now, if our musical codes are different, it may have a jarring effect on us. For example, the Indian music, classical music, is modal. There is no point and counterpoint in it. So for someone who's coming from classical North Indian musical tradition, to them, like this whole orchestra thing initially is just kind of noise, right? Because it's hard to figure out its rhythms. But once you kind of plot it, once you get used to it, that's exactly what happened to me. Here is Masood Raja, steeped in deep North Indian classical music tradition, right? And then marries Jenny Kaneen Raja, who is a trained, soprano, right? And sings classical music. So I had to learn to attune my ear to it. But the idea is that after I learned at least that code structure, right, then the words stopped mattering to me. So maybe that would be his answer, because there is a place here where he talks about the role of meta language in deciding the message or the code. That, for example, when he on page 1073, he talks about this natural tendency in human beings, and that also comes across in Chomsky, is that, where we ourselves say words in a way where they make perfect sense, right? Rhythmically speaking, right? But if someone asked me, why did you say Joan and Marjorie and not Marjorie and Joan, right? Or diamond and silk, why not silk and diamond, right? And the answer intuitively would be, well, it feels better that way. That feeling better part is metalingual, right? It can't be captured in language because it has got to do with the rhythms. My point is that even that is not universal, right? That aspect of understanding the unspoken part of a communicational act, where we fill in the gaps, where we feel a certain rhythm, is also culturally specific, right? Because, for example, in my personal example, the poetic tradition that I come from is the Persian ghazal poetic tradition, right? And it is always written to be sung, right? So you can bring me the most beautiful Shakespearean sonnet, right? I will understand it, I'll appreciate it technically, but it will never move me the way a ghazal moves me, right? In reading or in listening to. Now, that doesn't mean that the English sonnet is not a good poem, or the English poet is not writing a good poem. It's because the rhythms that I've internalized culturally of the meta language aspects of the language are the rhythms that I find appealing, right? And my mind accepts as balanced and even. So I think that's kind of what he's going with that aspect of the language. What I find instructive here is the room that he creates here is, remember in Saussure, we had learned that language must be studied synchronically, right, as a system, as it exists at a given point. And what he's insisting completely, and in his later work as well, is that language can be studied language can be studied synchronically, but also diachronically as to how a system of language changes over time. And so that's where also another challenge to Saussurian linguistics comes. So the room is being created here then of heading to what would eventually become post-structuralism, that this hierarchy of the established sign is kind of being eroded. And that's kind of an important lesson for us to learn. Now on page 1074, he goes on to say, the poetic function projects the principle of equivalences from the axis of selection into the axis of combination. Okay, now that is a reference to the heuristic that he puts up there, the emotive and conative functions of communicative act, and within that, referential, poetic, phatic, and metalingual. These are the, depending on where you put your emphasis, on addresser, addressee, on the language shifts, it either becomes poetic or it becomes just natural representation of the phenomena. And what he says is that this axis, whichever coincides with, let me read it for you. So when the emphasis is on the addressee, right, on the addresser, the message, the communicative act becomes emotive or expressive of a state of mind. How? So when you and me talk, right, if I am not listening to you, your complaint to me would be, you're not even hearing what I've said. So what that implies is that not only do you want me to hear the words that are coming out of your mouth, you also want me to be attentive to the tone, to the gestures, to your facial expressions. So absolutely then, what the addresser is saying to the addressee is, you are not receiving the emotive content of my message, right? What I'm saying. So emphasis, so the signification process changes if I give attention to the addressee, his or her intentions, his or her way of saying things. The same sign may convey something else, right? If I only focus on the addressee part of it, then I'm looking at that message from the point of view of what do I need to do, and it may not read into it the emotive content that the addresser is sending. That's why almost all imperatives, right, imply that we need to hear the command clearly and then act upon it. And we can only do that by reading the intent of the addresser. And by doing that, we have to focus on that message, right? And so that way, there will be a slight shift in the act of signification, which in Saussure would have been already fixed. Any sign used anywhere within any contemporary context would have meant the same thing. But what he's saying is, depending on what axis, what is at play in an act of communication, the meaning can shift, right? And the poetic function is when the emphasis is not on the addresser or on the addressee, but on the message itself, which is, I am a poem, right? I'm a piece of music, right? Drawing attention to its own technicality, its rhythms, its use of language. And that is where what he's saying is that instead of just reading the poem linguistically, right, we can also read what poetic function is, how does a poem work, and then bring together a kind of criticism which is both linguistically informed, but also informed by the conventions of literature. Now, what he is trying to suggest beyond the structure is that instead of signified and signifier just being the two, right, that an act of communication has more than just the signifier and signified. And he's trying to account for those, right? And how would the meaning shift and the function of an act of communication depending on which of the six is emphasized. So this concludes this edited version of the webinar. I hope it was useful to you. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send them my way, and I'll try to address them and answer them. I will keep posting more such materials both on the YouTube channel as well as on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, take care and peace and love.